Guess what else is in the swamp? A Long Walk Home. Yes, the title of the most recent episode of Swamp Thing. And a special guest star. Adrienne Barbeau plays a character from the CDC in this game. Of course, Adrienne was the love interest for Swamp Thing in the 1982 Swamp Thing film. She was not Abby Arcane. She was some other character. But, basically it's kind of in the same place as Abby is in this series. So, but right now she's the new boss of the CDC in Georgia. Abby, it's not that long of a road since she flew back to her home in Atlanta, and she goes back to her real job at the CDC with the sample she managed to get from the swamp somewhere in the dark. And from last episode, that nearly cost her life until Swamp Thing was able to save her, and then told her, "This is too dangerous. I don't want you being anywhere near here. You'll have to leave me behind," and all that sort of thing. So she goes back to the CDC, meets up again with her buddy, and they're talking about what happened. She tells him the whole story about Alec and all that sort of stuff, and I'll take your word for it. Then he gets abducted by some mysterious characters from the Concave, I believe, or Conclave, or whatever, some secret organization that kind of was the backing Avery Sunderland's plan and in hiring Dr. Woodrue and all this sort of stuff. And they already know about Swamp Thing and how, I don't know, I guess they just do. And they're manipulating the situation, and eventually leads to Swamp Thing being captured by the end. Meanwhile, Avery himself, of course, there was a plot to kill him. He was left in the swamp, but he had survived, as we saw at the end. And we see him wandering through the swamp, having hallucinations, or the swamp itself is torturing him with his guilt and whatnot, images from his past and all that. Or it's a bit of both. One of the high points of the Swamp Thing series is, of course, the special effects. They did a pretty good job on that. Certainly the setting and everything looks really good and creepy and spooky and all that stuff. But in this episode, Avery's hallucinations, well, there's a scene where he encounters his girlfriend, the sheriff. Oh, damn, what's her name? I'm forgetting. Matt Cable's mother. Of course, it's not her. It's an illusion form of her, or a phantom, if you will. And all of a sudden, these weird things sprout out of her eyes and all this stuff. But boy, is it really bad looking. Now, granted, it's an hallucination for Avery, and so maybe it wouldn't look real because it isn't, So you can give him a pass on that, but it did look kind of tacky. So Avery is being tormented by these things. And he even has a vision of his father. Now, all along, he said his father, the swamp took his father, so he had a grudge against the swamp itself. And, of course, the swamp has a grudge against him. And so he has this vision of he and his father out in the swamp. And then there's some tree out there that's really old, and he says it's a magic tree or some crap. And the father says, "Huh! Let me show you how powerful it is against an axe." And so he starts cutting on it, and then, the vines come and grab him and drag him into the campfire and burn him alive. I don't know if that's what he really meant, what happened to his father, if that was the ultimate fate. I took it to mean that he kept trying to make a living out of the swamp some way or another, maybe as a fisherman or what have you, and he went broke and in ruins and, drank himself to death. So maybe that's what it means, and like this is just a metaphorical way of showing the fate of his father, and he still holds the swamp responsible for his father's death. But boy, if this happened. So anyway, so he's tormented by that vision. So eventually he encounters Swamp Thing, and Swamp Thing ultimately saves his life. He brings him back to Alec's old lab, and he reveals himself, and they fuss at one another. But then Avery says, "I know a man who might be able to help you and turn you back into human." And that would be Woodrue, of course. And eventually he does find Woodrue, and Avery says, "I can take you to Alec." And of course, by then Woodrue explains him the deal with the conclave and all this. So he's basically leading Alec into a trap. But for a brief moment there, this Avery says, well, listen, this man saved my life. For a moment, he almost has a pang of conscience. But in the end, when the mercenaries or whatever that come to capture him, they're losing the battle with Swamp Thing, and then Avery picks up a shotgun and blows, shoots him down, and then they're able to use, I guess, a nitrogen to freeze Swamp Thing in place, and then they got him, and so now Woodrue can dissect him, I guess. Now, the next episode is, of course, called The Anatomy Lesson, and if you knew the comics with Alan Moore, that's the story that reveals the true nature of Swamp Thing. And spoilers, he's not Alec Holland. And, of course, when you first see Swamp Thing in this series and he doesn't know what he is, and he's pulling at himself, and he thinks he's covered in some kind of all this muck, and he tries to pull it off, but as he pulls it off, there's nothing underneath. It is him, So there is no way to turn this man into a human, because he never really was. So he has the memories and feelings of Alec Holland, but he is not Alec Holland. Alec Holland is dead. So Abby's in love with a vegetable. Yes, that's she's in love with the Swamp Thing. So meanwhile, Abby is still I'm sure, of course, she'll head back to Murray, but she while she's in this dealing with the CDC and all that, and her sample, they won't let her. They've locked her out. Adrienne Barbeau's character, Palmer, I think her name is, tells her, yeah, you're locked out, and you're on thin ice here, and all this stuff. And meanwhile, her buddy, I forget his name, the doctor who got sick at the time when they were treating the people with the plague, like I said earlier, he got abducted. And they told her, well, he's been assigned somewhere else. He had to leave in the first thing in the morning and all this stuff. Didn't have time to talk to you about it or whatever. Well, is he even alive? Who knows? They just picked him up and took him away. So I'm guessing she'll head back there and try to find Alec, but he's now in the custody of Dr. Woodrue. And since there's only 2 episodes left, I guess we're not going to get Blue Devil or Floronic Man. These were teases for potential future episodes in another season, but we're not going to get that. But it probably will. Woodrue will discover the true nature of Swamp Thing, and that'll be about it. Maybe it'll end on some sort of victory, seemingly, for Swamp Thing, and then Woodrue will come crawling out of the swamp, and he's the Floronic Man at that point. I don't know. But there you go. This was a good episode. It did get better. There was flaws in the series and whatnot, but it's not as bothersome as some other series I could mention. But it grew. it grew greener as it moved forward. And of course, always a nice touch for Adrienne Barbeau in there. I was a big fan of the day. I loved, Escape from New York. I like the original Swamp Thing movie. It's very, very basic and simple, and pretty much the same story in a lot of ways. Although in that version, he really is Alec Holland. And then, of course, like what was it? Escape from New York, of course, and Creep Show and stuff like that. And nice for them to have a little tribute for Miss Barbeau there in Swamp Thing. So there you go, another episode that was pretty good for the Swamp Thing series. It's just too bad it didn't get a chance when there's other series that are just god-awful and they just won't go away. But those are all different scenarios, and so there you are. All right, thank you for watching and listening. Say, why not like and subscribe? And, while you're here, check out the link description below. That'll take you to my many stores that have plenty of goodies for you.